In the middle of the 19th century, economics was still searching for solid ground. Much of the discipline leaned heavily on grand abstractions, labor values, objective costs, and sweeping historical laws that claimed to explain prices, wages, and wealth as if they followed mechanical rules. It was into this intellectual landscape that Carl Menger quietly stepped, not with a manifesto, but with a method. Menger was not interested in economics as a system of moral judgments or historical inevitabilities. He wanted to know something more basic and more unsettling. Why do people value things at all? Not societies in the abstract, not classes or nations, but individual human beings making choices under conditions of scarcity. At the time, the dominant explanation for value was rooted in production. Goods were thought to be valuable because of the labor embedded in them, or because of the objective costs required to produce them. This framework worked reasonably well for explaining long-run prices of manufactured goods, but it struggled with obvious contradictions. Why is water essential to life, often cheaper than diamonds? Why do two people value the same object differently, even when its production cost is identical? Menger saw these puzzles not as anomalies, but as clues that the entire framework was upside down. His key move was deceptively simple. Value does not exist in objects, it exists in minds. Goods are not valuable because of what went into making them. They are valuable because individuals believe those goods can satisfy their wants. This was a radical departure. It shifted economics away from external measures, labor hours, material inputs, historical class relations, and toward subjective evaluation. Crucially, Menger did not mean subjective in a loose or psychological sense. He was not saying value was arbitrary or emotional. Instead, he argued that value arises from a rational assessment of importance. Individuals rank their needs, food, shelter, comfort, luxury, and assign value to goods based on how well those goods serve their most urgent, unmet wants. This perspective forced a rethinking of economic causality. Classical economists tended to see prices as emerging from production conditions first and consumption second. Menger reversed the arrow. Consumer valuations come first, production follows. Entrepreneurs do not create value by producing goods. They anticipate value by predicting what consumers will want and how strongly they will want it. This reversal also explains why value changes over time without any change in production costs. If tastes shift, if alternatives emerge, if expectations change, then value changes, even if the factory, labor, and materials remain the same. For Menger, this was not a flaw of markets, but a fundamental feature of human choice. Another important element of Menger's early work was his rejection of purely aggregate thinking. He was skeptical of explanations that relied on averages, totals, or national-level abstractions without grounding them in individual action. Markets, he argued, are not entities with intentions. They are patterns that emerge from countless individual decisions interacting with one another. This emphasis on individual choice laid the foundation for what would later be called methodological individualism, the idea that economic phenomena must be explained by tracing them back to the actions and beliefs of individuals, not by appealing to collective forces as independent agents. Yet Menger was not a reductionist. He did not deny the existence of social institutions, norms, or market structures. Instead, he viewed them as emergent outcomes, not as starting assumptions. Money, prices, trade networks, and even legal systems were, in his view, the unintended results of individuals trying to solve practical problems over time. Segment 1, then, establishes the core tension that defines Menger's contribution: economics as a science of human choice under scarcity, rather than a mechanical accounting of production. Everything that follows, his theory of marginal value, his explanation of price formation, his account of money's origin, flows from this initial break. In the next segment, we will move deeper into the concept that made this break precise and operational: marginal utility, and how Menger used it to resolve the paradoxes that classical economics could not. If segment 1 marked Carl Menger's break with classical economics, marginal utility is the concept that made that break mathematically and logically precise. It was here that Carl Menger provided a solution to problems that had lingered unresolved for centuries, most famously, the paradox of value. The classical paradox was simple to state and difficult to explain. Why is water, which is essential for life, typically cheap, while diamonds, which are not essential, are extremely expensive? Classical theories grounded in labor or production costs struggled here. Water often requires significant labor and infrastructure, while diamonds in some cases require less ongoing effort once discovered. Yet market prices told a very different story. Menger's answer was not to look at total usefulness, but at usefulness at the margin. Individuals do not evaluate goods based on their total contribution to survival or happiness. They evaluate them based on the importance of the least important use that the available quantity can satisfy. This is a subtle but profound shift. It means value is always tied to the next unit, not to the entire stock. Consider water. In most developed societies, water is abundant. The first units of water satisfy extremely urgent needs: drinking, sanitation, food preparation. But because supply is ample, additional units are allocated to progressively less important uses: washing cars, watering lawns, filling decorative fountains. The value of the last unit, the marginal unit, is therefore low, and prices reflect that low marginal importance. Diamonds are the opposite case. They are scarce. The first units are allocated to their most valued uses: status signaling, durable ornamentation, long-term wealth storage. There are no surplus units drifting into low-importance uses. As a result, the marginal unit of a diamond satisfies a relatively high-ranked want, and its price is correspondingly high. What matters is not how important a good is in the abstract, but how important the next available unit is to the individual making a choice. Menger emphasized that this logic applies universally. It governs not just luxury goods but basic necessities, labor decisions, and even time allocation. A worker does not decide whether labor itself is valuable in general. They decide whether one more hour of labor is worth more than leisure, rest, or alternative employment. Again, the decision is marginal. This insight also dismantled the idea that value could be measured objectively. Two individuals with identical incomes and facing identical prices may still value the same good differently because their existing endowments and ranked needs differ. A glass of water is far more valuable to someone crossing a desert than to someone sitting beside a river. The object has not changed, the marginal context has. Importantly, Menger's theory of marginal utility was ordinal, not numerical. Individuals rank preferences; they do not assign measurable units of pleasure or utility. Economics, in Menger's view, does not require us to quantify satisfaction, only to understand that people can compare alternatives and choose the one they prefer more strongly at the margin. This stands in contrast to later developments that tried to formalize utility mathematically. Menger was careful here. He believed economics should explain why choices occur, not pretend to measure subjective experience with false precision. The ranking of needs is sufficient to generate prices, exchange, and market coordination. Marginal utility also clarified how prices emerge without invoking labor values. Prices reflect the marginal valuations of buyers and sellers interacting in the market. Sellers give up goods whose marginal value to them is lower than the money they receive. Buyers give up money whose marginal value to them is lower than the goods they receive. Exchange occurs because both sides expect a gain. This logic explains why voluntary trade is not a zero-sum game. Each party values what they receive more than what they give up at the margin, even though outsiders may judge the objects as equal or unequal in some objective sense. By grounding value in marginal utility, Menger provided economics with a unified explanatory principle. Scarcity, choice, price, and exchange all become expressions of the same underlying mechanism: individuals allocating limited means toward ranked ends. In the next segment, we will extend this logic from individual valuation to price formation, showing how subjective marginal values coordinate across markets without any central direction, and why this coordination is inherently dynamic rather than static. Once value is understood as subjective and marginal, the next question naturally follows. How do individual valuations become observable market prices? This was one of Carl Menger's most important achievements, showing that prices are not imposed by production costs, social classes, or historical laws, but emerge from the interaction of many individual assessments of value. For Carl Menger, prices are not primary facts. They are outcomes. To understand them, one must look beneath the surface of the market to the logic of exchange. Every exchange begins with unequal valuations. If two parties value the goods in question equally, no trade occurs. Trade only happens when each participant expects to gain, when the marginal value of what they receive exceeds the marginal value of what they give up. This is not a psychological trick or a moral claim. It is a structural requirement for voluntary exchange. Menger illustrated this with simple barter examples before extending the logic to monetary economies. Suppose several buyers and sellers meet in a market. Each buyer has a maximum price they are willing to pay based on the marginal utility of the good relative to their money. Each seller has a minimum price they are willing to accept based on the marginal utility of keeping the good versus acquiring money. These reservation prices are not visible. They exist only in the minds of individuals. Yet when buyers and sellers interact, a range of possible exchange prices emerges. Actual market prices settle within this range, bounded by the highest rejected bid and the lowest rejected offer. Importantly, Menger did not treat price as a single equilibrium point determined by abstract curves. Instead, he saw it as the result of concrete negotiation under scarcity. Different trades may occur at slightly different prices, and price movements reflect changes in underlying marginal valuations as circumstances evolve. This perspective has two major implications. First, prices transmit information. They condense dispersed knowledge about preferences, scarcities, and alternatives into a single signal. No individual knows the full structure of demand or supply, yet prices coordinate action by reflecting the marginal decisions of many people simultaneously. Menger did not yet formalize this as later Austrian economists would, but the insight is already present. Second, prices are inherently dynamic. They change when tastes shift, when supplies increase or decrease, when new uses for goods are discovered, or when expectations about the future alter present decisions. There is no true or natural price anchored permanently in costs. Costs themselves are prices, prices of labor, land, and capital, ultimately rooted in consumer valuations further downstream. This leads to one of Menger's most destabilizing claims. Production costs do not determine prices. Prices determine production costs. Entrepreneurs are willing to pay for labor, machinery, and raw materials only because they expect to sell the final product at a price consumers will accept. If consumer demand collapses, the value of inputs collapses with it. Seen this way, factor prices are derivative, not foundational. Menger also rejected the idea that prices represent social averages or collective intentions. There is no market mind deciding what a good is worth. Prices are the unintended result of overlapping individual plans, each constrained by limited knowledge and resources. This has methodological consequences. If prices are outcomes of human action, then economic theory must begin with the logic of choice, not with statistical aggregates. Averages may describe markets after the fact, but they cannot explain how prices come into being in the first place. Finally, Menger emphasized that price formation does not require perfect competition or ideal conditions. Even in small markets with few participants and imperfect information, the same marginal logic applies. Prices may be volatile or uneven, but they still reflect underlying valuations interacting through exchange. Segment 3 thus completes the bridge from individual psychology to social coordination. Subjective value does not dissolve into chaos. It organizes itself through market prices. What appears externally as an impersonal system is, at its core, a continuous process of human choice adjusting to scarcity. In the next segment, we will move from prices to goods themselves, examining Menger's theory of economic goods, orders of goods, and the causal structure that links consumer wants to complex production chains. With value and price grounded in individual choice, Carl Menger turned to a deeper question. What makes something an economic good in the first place? His answer reshaped how economists think about production, causality, and the invisible architecture that connects consumer wants to complex industrial systems. For Menger, not all useful things are economic goods. A thing becomes an economic good only when four conditions are met. A human need exists. The thing is capable of satisfying that need. People recognize this causal connection. The thing is scarce relative to demand. If any one of these conditions fails, the object may be useful, but it is not economic. Air, for example, satisfies vital needs but is generally not scarce, so it carries no price and does not enter economic calculation. This definition keeps economics focused on scarcity and choice, rather than on usefulness alone. From here, Menger introduced one of his most influential analytical tools, the concept of orders of goods. Goods of the first order are consumer goods, items that directly satisfy human wants such as food, clothing, or shelter. Goods of higher orders, second, third, and beyond, are producer goods. They do not directly satisfy wants but contribute causally to the production of first-order goods. Tools, machines, raw materials, and intermediate components all fall into this category. This framework allowed Menger to trace value backward through time. The value of higher-order goods does not originate in themselves. It is imputed to them from expected value of the consumer goods they help produce. A steel mill is valuable not because steel is intrinsically valuable, but because steel can be used to produce goods consumers are willing to pay for. This process, later called imputation, reverses classical cost-based reasoning. Labor, land, and capital do not confer value upward. Instead, anticipated consumer demand pulls value downward through the production structure. Menger emphasized that this chain is causal and temporal. Production unfolds over time, often across many stages. Decisions made today about mining, manufacturing, and transportation are guided by expectations about future consumer wants. This makes production inherently speculative. Entrepreneurs must judge not only what consumers want now, but what they will want when goods finally reach the market. Errors are inevitable. When expectations are wrong, resources are misallocated. But these errors are not random. They are disciplined by profit and loss. Successful anticipation is rewarded, while failure imposes costs. Menger saw this not as a flaw, but as the mechanism by which markets learn. Another crucial implication of the orders of goods framework is that complex economies depend on coordination without central direction. No single actor understands the entire production chain linking raw materials to finished goods. Yet the system holds together because price signals communicate marginal valuations at each stage. When consumer demand shifts, prices of first-order goods change. These changes ripple backward, altering the value of higher-order goods and reshaping production patterns. Entire industries can rise or fall as a result of changes in consumer preferences, even when no one explicitly commands them to do so. Menger also rejected the idea that production structures are fixed. Technological change can alter the number of stages, the time required, and the kinds of capital goods involved. New knowledge can transform previously useless materials into valuable resources by revealing new causal connections to human needs. Seen through this lens, an economy is not a static equilibrium, but a living structure of interdependent plans stretched across time and coordinated by prices. Segment 4 thus deepens Menger's vision of economics as a causal science. Goods are not isolated objects, they are nodes in a temporal network linking human wants to material reality. In the next segment, we will examine one of Menger's most original contributions, his explanation of the spontaneous origin of money and how a medium of exchange can emerge without law, decree, or central authority. Few topics in economics seem as inseparable from the state as money. Coins, banknotes, legal tender laws, and central banks all suggest deliberate design and authority. Yet Carl Menger advanced a far more unsettling claim. Money is not a creation of law, but the unintended outcome of market exchange. Menger approached money not as an institution to be justified, but as a problem to be explained. If individuals initially exchange goods directly, how does a particular good come to be accepted not for its own use, but because it can be traded again later? The answer lies in the limits of barter. In a barter economy, exchange requires a double coincidence of wants. Each party must possess what the other desires at the same time and in compatible quantities. As markets grow and specialization increases, this coincidence becomes increasingly rare. Trade opportunities are lost not because goods lack value, but because exchange is too cumbersome. Menger observed that some goods are more saleable than others. Saleability refers to how easily a good can be exchanged for other goods at predictable prices and with minimal loss. Durability, divisibility, transportability, and widespread demand all increase saleability. Individuals, seeking to improve their trading position, begin to accept goods they do not directly want, provided those goods are easier to trade later. This is not a collective decision. Each individual acts independently, guided by experience and observation. Over time, this process becomes self-reinforcing. Goods that are already widely accepted become even more saleable because everyone expects others to accept them. Eventually, one or a few goods dominate as general media of exchange. At no point is law required. No committee votes on money. No authority decrees its use. Money emerges because it solves a practical problem faced by traders operating under scarcity and uncertainty. Menger's account also explains why historically money often took the form of commodities like gold and silver. These metals possessed high saleability long before they were used as money. Their monetary role was an extension of existing market advantages, not an arbitrary choice. This theory carries an important methodological lesson. Social institutions can arise without intention, design, or shared agreement. They are the cumulative result of individual actions, none of which aim at creating the institution itself. Money is an order that grows, not one that is made. Menger was careful to distinguish this explanation from moral or political claims. He was not arguing that all money must be commodity money, nor that governments have no role in monetary systems. His point was historical and analytical. To understand money, one must explain how individuals would arrive at it even in the absence of authority. This insight later became foundational for the Austrian School's skepticism toward purely constructivist economic planning. If money itself emerges spontaneously, then attempts to redesign complex economic systems from the top down face severe knowledge problems. Money in Menger's framework is thus a bridge between subjective valuation and large-scale coordination. It allows indirect exchange, expands markets, deepens specialization, and lengthens production chains, all without requiring centralized control. In the next segment, we will turn from markets to methodology, examining Menger's dispute with the German historical school and how this debate shaped the future of economic theory. By the late 19th century, Carl Menger's ideas had begun to attract attention and resistance. The resistance did not come primarily from disagreements over prices or money, but from a deeper conflict about what economics itself should be. This conflict became known as the Methodenstreit, the battle over method, and it shaped the trajectory of economic thought for generations. At the center of this dispute stood Carl Menger, arguing that economics must be a theoretical science grounded in universal principles of human action. Opposing him were economists who believed that economic knowledge could only be derived from historical study, statistical observation, and institutional comparison. The disagreement was not about whether history mattered. Menger did not deny the value of historical research. What he rejected was the claim that history alone could generate economic theory. Menger argued that history records what happened, not why it had to happen. Without theory, historical facts remain descriptive. They cannot explain causal relationships. To understand prices, money, or capital, one must first understand the logic of choice, scarcity, and valuation that governs human behavior across all times and places. From Menger's perspective, economic laws are not empirical generalizations like those in the natural sciences. They are logical relationships derived from the fact that humans act purposefully. If individuals prefer some outcomes to others and face scarcity, certain patterns necessarily follow. Exchange, price formation, specialization, and indirect trade among them. This view placed Menger firmly in opposition to economists who emphasized national uniqueness, cultural specificity, and historical stages of development. They believed economic behavior varied so much across societies that universal laws were either trivial or misleading. Menger countered that while institutions differ, the underlying logic of action does not. A medieval peasant, a 19th century merchant, and a modern consumer all rank needs, choose among alternatives, and respond to incentives. The forms change, the causal structure remains. A critical point in the Methodenstreit was Menger's defense of exact laws in economics. By this, he did not mean precise numerical predictions. He meant laws that hold conditionally. If certain circumstances are present, certain outcomes tend to follow. Economics, in his view, explains tendencies, not exact quantities. This distinction mattered. It allowed economics to be rigorous without pretending to forecast prices or growth rates with mechanical accuracy. Theory provides understanding, not prophecy. Menger also warned that an exclusive focus on statistics risks confusing correlation with causation. Large data sets can describe patterns, but they cannot explain why individuals acted as they did. Without theory, policy conclusions drawn from data alone may rest on fragile foundations. The Methodenstreit was not resolved in Menger's lifetime, but its consequences were profound. Menger's approach laid the groundwork for what later became the Austrian School of Economics, emphasizing theory, subjectivism, and causal explanation. His opponents influenced traditions that favored empirical and institutional analysis. Rather than viewing this as a winner-take-all conflict, Menger saw the debate as clarifying boundaries. History could inform economics, but could not replace theory. Economics, in turn, could illuminate historical events, but it could not predict them with certainty. Segment 6 thus reveals Menger not just as a theorist of markets, but as a philosopher of economic science. He was defining how economists should reason, what kinds of claims they could responsibly make, and where the limits of their knowledge lay. In the next segment, we will explore how Menger's ideas were taken up and expanded by his intellectual heirs, forming the early core of the Austrian School, and how his emphasis on subjectivism shaped later theories of capital, time, and entrepreneurship. By the time Carl Menger's major theoretical contributions were widely recognized, they had already begun to form something larger than a single body of work. Without intending to found a school in the institutional sense, Carl Menger laid the conceptual foundations for what would later be known as the Austrian School of Economics. What unified this emerging tradition was not a shared policy agenda, but a shared analytical orientation. At its core was Menger's insistence that economics begins with individual choice, subjective value, and causal explanation. This emphasis distinguished the Austrian approach from both classical political economy and later formalist traditions. One of the most important elements Menger passed on was subjectivism, the idea that economic phenomena cannot be explained without reference to how individuals perceive, evaluate, and anticipate the world. Value, cost, and even profit are not objective magnitudes. They are reflections of human judgment under uncertainty. This subjectivism naturally extended into the analysis of time. Production takes time. Decisions made today are based on expectations about an uncertain future. Menger's framework treated time not as a technical inconvenience, but as a fundamental feature of economic life. Later Austrian economists would build on this insight to develop theories of capital that emphasize production stages, time structure, and intertemporal coordination. These developments trace directly back to Menger's concept of higher-order goods and the imputation of value from consumer demand backward through time. Another lasting contribution was Menger's view of entrepreneurship. Although he did not formalize entrepreneurship as a separate theory, his work implicitly defined the entrepreneur as the agent who anticipates future consumer wants and organizes production accordingly. Profit emerges when anticipation is correct, loss emerges when it is not. This framing places entrepreneurship at the center of market coordination, rather than treating firms as passive production functions. Markets are not equilibrated by abstract forces. They are continuously adjusted by individuals making judgment calls under uncertainty. Menger's influence also shaped the Austrian emphasis on process over equilibrium. Rather than focusing on static end states, the Austrian tradition views markets as ongoing discovery procedures. Prices, profits, and losses are signals generated within this process, not indicators of final balance. Importantly, Menger's legacy was not methodological isolationism. While he defended theory against purely historical approaches, he did not reject empirical observation. Instead, he insisted that facts become meaningful only when interpreted through a coherent theoretical lens. This balance between theory and observation became a defining feature of the Austrian school's self-understanding. Theory provides a map, history provides a terrain. Confusing the two leads either to empty abstraction or to unstructured description. By segment 7, it becomes clear that Menger's influence cannot be reduced to any single concept. His work reshaped how economists think about value, prices, money, production, and method, creating a framework flexible enough to be extended, yet disciplined enough to resist ad hoc reasoning. In the next segment, we will examine how Menger's ideas contrast with competing economic traditions, particularly classical political economy and later neoclassical formalism, and why these differences still matter for economic analysis today. To understand the distinctiveness of Carl Menger's contribution, it helps to see it in contrast. His ideas did not simply add new tools to existing economics, they reoriented the discipline's center of gravity. By comparing Menger's approach with both classical political economy and later neoclassical formalism, the contours of his legacy become sharper. For Carl Menger, the fundamental error of classical economics lay in its objective theory of value. Classical thinkers sought stable anchors, labor time, production costs, or social classes, to explain prices and distribution. These explanations worked best at a high level of abstraction, but faltered when confronted with real-world variability, preference diversity, and changing tastes. Menger's critique was not merely empirical, it was causal. Classical theories began at the wrong end of the economic process. By treating costs as determinants of value, they overlook the fact that costs themselves are prices of labor, land, and capital, each of which must ultimately be explained by subjective valuation elsewhere in the economy. In this sense, Menger's theory was radically downstream-oriented. Everything flows from consumer choice. Production, wages, rents, and interest are all secondary phenomena, derived from expectations about future demand. Classical economics inverted this relationship, mistaking symptoms for causes. Neoclassical economics, which emerged shortly after Menger's work, accepted many of his insights, especially marginal analysis and subjective value. Yet it took a different path. Where Menger emphasized causal explanation in words and logic, neoclassical economists increasingly emphasized mathematical formalization. This divergence matters. Neoclassical models often represent economic agents as perfectly informed optimizers operating in equilibrium. Preferences are given, technology is known, and uncertainty is either abstracted away or reduced to probability distributions. These models are powerful for certain analytical tasks, but they quietly change the subject. Menger's economics is not about equilibrium states, it is about how coordination emerges despite ignorance. Real individuals do not know the full structure of the economy. They learn, adapt, and revise plans over time. Prices are not solutions to equations, they are signals generated through competitive interaction. Where neoclassical theory tends to treat time as a parameter, Menger treated it as a constraint and source of error. Production unfolds sequentially. Mistakes cannot be undone costlessly. Capital is specific, not homogeneous. These features resist clean mathematical representation, but are central to real economic life. Another contrast lies in the treatment of knowledge. Neoclassical models often assume knowledge implicitly, embedding it in functional relationships. Menger insisted that knowledge is dispersed, incomplete, and often tacit. Institutions like money and prices exist precisely because no one possesses comprehensive information. This difference leads to divergent views on policy. If markets are assumed to be near equilibrium systems with known structures, intervention appears relatively straightforward. If markets are discovery processes operating under uncertainty, intervention risks disrupting signals that no planner fully understands. Menger himself was cautious here. He did not build a policy doctrine. His concern was analytical clarity, not prescription. But his framework naturally raises doubts about ambitious economic design, especially when it relies on aggregate data rather than individual incentives and knowledge constraints. Segment 8 thus clarifies that Menger stands apart from both his predecessors and many of his successors. He shared the classical concern with explanation rather than mere description, but rejected their objectivism. He shared the neoclassical use of marginal reasoning, but rejected their fixation on equilibrium and formalism. In the next segment, we will turn to Menger's theory of institutions more broadly, exploring how law, norms, and social orders can emerge organically from individual actions, extending the same logic that explained money to the wider structure of society. By the later stages of his work, Carl Menger had extended his economic reasoning beyond prices and money toward more general theory of social institutions. The same logic that explained the spontaneous emergence of money, he argued, also applied to many of the most durable structures of social life. Once again, Carl Menger challenged the assumption that complex order requires conscious design. Menger distinguished sharply between institutions that are pragmatic outcomes of human action and those that are the result of deliberate legislation. Language, customary law, markets, and money belong to the first category. They arise not because anyone planned them, but because individuals repeatedly adopted practices that solved recurring problems. This distinction matters because it reframes how coordination occurs in large societies. Order does not necessarily flow from authority downward. Often, it emerges from countless local adjustments made by individuals responding to incentives, constraints, and feedback. Menger's institutional analysis rests on a simple insight. Individuals seek to reduce uncertainty. When certain practices prove reliable, they are imitated, stabilized, and eventually taken for granted. Over time, these practices harden into institutions, even though no one ever set out to create them as such. Consider property norms. Long before formal legal systems existed, communities develop informal rules governing possession, use, and transfer. These rules were not abstract moral principles imposed from above. They were practical solutions to conflicts over scarce resources. Only later were they codified into law. Menger emphasized that this process is evolutionary, not teleological. Institutions are not optimized designs aiming at perfection. They are contingent outcomes shaped by historical accidents, local conditions, and path dependence. Some endure because they work tolerably well, others disappear when they fail. This view rejects both naive rationalism and naive historicism. Institutions are neither the product of pure reason nor the inevitable outcome of historical stages. They are emergent responses to recurring coordination problems faced by individuals. Importantly, Menger did not argue that all emergent institutions are desirable or efficient. persistence does not imply optimality. Some institutions survive because they are difficult to change, not because they serve current needs well. Understanding their origin helps explain their resilience, but not necessarily justify their continuation. This perspective also sheds light on why institutional reform is so difficult. Changing formal rules without understanding the underlying informal practices often leads to unintended consequences. Legislation may alter incentives on paper while leaving deeper coordination mechanisms untouched or, worse, disrupted. Menger's theory of institutions thus reinforces a central theme of his economics: causal explanation over surface description. To understand social order, one must trace it back to individual actions and the problems those actions were attempting to solve. Segment 9 broadens Menger's relevance beyond economics narrowly defined. His ideas anticipate later work in sociology, legal theory, and political economy that emphasize spontaneous order and emergent complexity. In the final segment, we will draw these threads together, assessing Menger's lasting influence, the limits of his framework, and why his approach continues to shape debates about markets, knowledge, and coordination in the modern world. With a full arc of his work in view, Carl Menger stands less as a historical figure frozen in 19th century debates and more as a structural thinker whose ideas continue to frame how we understand markets, institutions, and coordination under uncertainty. Menger's most enduring contribution is not any single theory, but a way of reasoning about economic life. He redirected economics toward the logic of individual choice, subjective value, and causal explanation. In doing so, he stripped away many comforting simplifications, objective value, automatic equilibrium, and centralized design, and replaced them with a more demanding vision of markets as evolving processes driven by imperfect knowledge. His framework proved remarkably fertile. Theories of marginal utility, price formation, capital structure, entrepreneurship, and spontaneous order all trace back to his insistence that economic phenomena must be explained from the bottom up. Even schools of thought that diverged sharply from the Austrian tradition absorbed elements of Menger's subjectivism, often without acknowledging its origin. At the same time, Menger's approach has clear limits. His emphasis on qualitative causal explanation resists easy quantification. This makes his framework less suited to short-term forecasting, econometric modeling, or policy calibration based on aggregate data. Critics argue that without measurement, theory risks becoming insulated from empirical testing. Menger would likely have accepted this trade-off. His goal was not predictive precision, but explanatory coherence. Economics, as he understood it, explains why certain patterns tend to emerge, not exactly when or by how much. The cost of this humility is reduced policy confidence. The benefit is reduced policy hubris. Another limitation lies in institutional inertia. While Menger explained how institutions emerge, he offered relatively little guidance on how they should be reformed when conditions change. His framework explains stability better than transformation. Later thinkers would attempt to fill this gap with mixed success. Yet these limits do not diminish his relevance. If anything, they sharpen it. In a world increasingly shaped by complex systems, dispersed knowledge, and unintended consequences, Menger's warnings against top-down design sound less antiquated and more prescient. Modern debates over market regulation, monetary design, platform economies, and algorithmic coordination all echo themes Menger raised long before digital networks existed. Who holds knowledge? How is it communicated? What happens when signals are distorted? These are not new questions. They are Menger's questions translated into new contexts. Perhaps most importantly, Menger reminds us that economic order is fragile, adaptive, and deeply human. It rests not on equations or decrees, but on countless judgments made under uncertainty, judgments that can succeed, fail, and evolve over time. In InSlowSpective fashion, his work invites patience rather than certainty. It asks us to look beneath outcomes to processes, beneath aggregates to individuals, and beneath institutions to the problems they originally solved. That ultimately is Carl Menger's legacy. Not a closed system of answers, but a disciplined way of seeing how order emerges when human beings, constrained by scarcity and guided by imperfect knowledge, attempt to make sense of a world and trade within it.